Welcome to Super Magic Agency Powers, the podcast designed to help you improve your soft skills and become an amazing agency consultant. Today, let's talk to Kristian Foged from Simply Thought. As a professional communicator, you have to have a decent grasp of words and pictures so you can get your story across. But nowadays, you also need more than that. You need to understand numbers and you need a good grasp of data so that you can base your stories and creative ideas on real insights. That way, you know you're more likely to have some kind of impact on the target audiences you're trying to reach. Now, it's a growing specialism. There's more and more companies and agencies starting up that are all based around using real numbers. And it's the reason that I wanted to talk to Kristian Foged today, who is the owner of Simply Thought, a relatively new agency that specializes in data and insights. It's something he's done for a while in his career now. And I wanted to know a few things about the way he works and how he thinks. Kristian, do you think that the use of data is an overlooked skill for PR people?
I don't know if it's so much overlooked as it used to be. I think it's entering more and more the consciousness. But where I think that it struggles is, quite frankly, is a lot of people don't want to do it. It's a bit of a pain point. It's not what we associate with the industry. It's not how we lure talent into the industry. And people at the entry level don't think about data and analysis as what they're going to have to do coming into a creative PR career. They think that they're going to get to work on these campaigns and come with creative ideas. And we don't necessarily spend or invest the time to kind of big up and invest in the back end of that, what happens before the kind of creative brainstorming and all the insights analytics that goes into it and research that should inform that creative process.
Now, I've often found that people have trouble getting their clients to pay for any research before they come up with their campaigns. Is it still the case that people have trouble finding budgets for research?
I think it certainly is. And I think it's also a question of who you're speaking to in the organization. Sometimes that comes across. It's an interesting one because on the one hand, you have this challenge of clients not always wanting to pay for research, but at the same time, they also want the reassurance of research and data and that we aren't just doing guesswork, right? So the kind of common objection or the objection handling that I go for is if we don't do some research, if we don't ask our audiences, if we don't look at what people are talking about, what journalists are writing about, we're doing guesswork. And then you're relying on gut feeling. And to an extent, gut is based on experience for many people. But it's also a constantly changing media environment, dynamics and channels and audience preferences. And we can't keep assuming that we are the audience if we want to actually reach people and connect with them. And the joke I sometimes make with my clients is that I'm really good at what I do because I have no idea who you're trying to reach. And often we have to be very careful to not be the audience, even if on some level, demographically, we fit into the audiences that we're trying to reach in some ways, then we still aren't the audience. And I make it, even if I'm doing campaigns for people that are trying to reach, campaigns that are trying to reach millennials who are of ethnic minority, I still make it a point to do research behind that because I'm not everyone. And in fact, many of my views may be in the minority among these people, and maybe my consumption habits may be in the minority among them. I think as soon as we enter the role of thinking about a brand obsessively, of either whether we're in-house or whether we're an agency, if we are focusing on the brand so much and focusing on how to communicate their story, we instantly lose the objective point of view of the audience that we're trying to reach. Because they're not thinking about us as often, they're not looking for us. And the same thing with journalists. They're not looking to cover our story. We have to make them interested in it, right? If you think of journalists as well as a form of audience or gatekeepers for a story when it comes to media relations. So I think that we have to fight our instinct, and the instinct to think that we instinctively know what our audiences want or want to hear is both a strength, but it can also be a weakness if we aren't willing to be validated by data, if we aren't willing to be challenged by the research as well.
So as communicators, we're known for being good at coming up with creative ideas. Now, you said that you can't be creative without the right kind of insights. How do you think your work helps people to be creative?
So the way that I see our role at Simply Thought is really to give you everything that you need right up until that kind of creative brainstorm and jump off point. And I kind of see the creative process and I throw my hands up in the air and say, I'm not the creative in the room. I'm not the one who comes up with a great idea in the brainstorm. And I realized that relatively early in my career. Where I'm really good is kind of putting that information and everything that should shape that creative idea and the research and insights behind it and shape the thinking and the strategy behind it. And then on the other side is the kind of planning on how does this idea translate on a channel level, on a planned execution level. So where I see Simply Thought fitting in is kind of bookending the creative process. So at the start of it, before we've even gone into a creative idea, before there's a creative brief, what is the information that we actually need to not just inform and kind of give the focus of the creative brief, but also to get those thoughts going, right? What's our thought starters? What's our jump off points? What is the pieces of the nuggets information that kind of give the focus and start the ideas churning? And I don't see data and insights as a way of restricting data, or restricting the creative process. I see it as a way of actually setting it loose and giving it a focus and giving it that kind of target to hit, right? And then on the other side, I see what Simply Thought does is at the bookend is actually measuring the impact of that and ensuring that we kind of both take the learnings at the end and put that back into the creative process for next time and inform our strategy for the next iteration of campaigning.
Do you think that agency people need to generally have a better level of numeracy?
Yes. And I mean, that's a very biased position, but I should say that the reason why I think PR should get better at, or the fact that I think PR should get better at data and numeracy is not a position I have because I'm selling it or it was Simply Thought. It's the position I had before, and it's why I set Simply Thought up, right? It's to help agencies to get better at understanding this and make sense of it, and for it to inform our creative process and our strategies to make them more effective. I don't think that we can really get around it anymore, because the truth of the matter is that data is coming at us left, right, and center in different forms. And the vast majority of data that clients have, they don't know what to do with. They know there's something in there and they know that there's something of value, but they don't know how to break it out. They don't know how to do it. And they don't know what data is valuable for their purposes and what isn't. So the better that we can get at telling them that and making sense of the data for them, the better position that we're in to actually both sell into the clients and be of value to them and show them how they can get value from it. But also we're in a better position to know that how our campaigns will be effective. We'll know better which audiences we should be trying to reach and what message is going to resonate with them. We'll know how to get campaigns that don't just get coverage, but also get traction and get shared and get talked about, right? So the better that we get at data, I think the better that we can be at creative process. And it should be said as well, I don't believe in data being purely numbers. I also believe very much in the qualitative elements of data, right? There can be nuggets in a focus group that you just won't see in a statistic. A single thought or a single statement that comes from a qualitative phone interview after 10 interviews with customers, right? So data shouldn't just be thought of as numeracy, but I think that's an important part of it to make sense of the numbers as well. And it's not that this needs to be a rocket science by any means. I'm no mathematician or statistician, but if you can get basic statistics, if you can understand basic ways to cut data and to understand what's meaningful and to understand how to get to the important bits, that's the thing that you really need to nail as a PR.
For someone who's working at a smaller agency or with smaller budgets, what advice would you give them to behave in a way that you do when it comes to their agency services? How could they be more like you?
I mean, I think the first thing is it's great. The amount of and this is probably definitely something that's happened in newer years, but the amount of technology that's available for free or at a very affordable level for smaller agencies. We know smaller agencies are always going to invest in media databases, and now there's databases that also offer monitoring, analysis, and at least the top level of insights and analytics, right? For both planning purposes, but also for measurement. Google Analytics is something that every agency should ask their clients for access to, as well as using the likes of Google Data Studio for integrating some of those analytics and analyzing it. So there's a host of free tools. I think, there's a couple of resources out there that have been written and shared. I think Gemma Rooney from Shook did a blog with Stephen Waddington or his blog on free measurement tools and free planning tools. So all these resources are kind of becoming available to do it at least at the kind of core fundamental level. And I'd say as well, there's actually an advantage in being a young agency starting out, because you don't have these huge old processes that need to be shifted around to meet this need. You can actually start by thinking about how to build your agency with this baked into it, how to build these best practices from the go. And it's easier to move when you're small and make that change or make that investment in time than it is later on. And there's always the option to kind of upgrade your tools. But if you start with that mentality and you start with that approach, then you can go for it.
These free tools are all very well, but some of them do look quite intimidating and complex. Is there some kind of free training that comes with this stuff?
Absolutely. I think definitely when you're looking at some of the the free tools that are put out by bigger platforms, so let's say the likes of Google and Google Analytics, then there's tons of free resources and training. LinkedIn, a lot of training resources can be done through that actually, and they have some great courses on both LinkedIn Analytics, Facebook Analytics, Google Analytics, etc., as well as the in-platform one. So Facebook will also do training on their analytics and their paid, though that's more focused on their paid media. As well as the fact that a lot of these tools that they will try to get into your hands, especially the ones that are not necessarily free but are lower cost investment. So some of the databases like Viewleo or Propel PR, they'll of course do onboarding with you when you make an investment, and they'll do demos to get people on board with their tools as well. So it is intimidating and it is tough to wrap your head around all the different options. Definitely agree with that, and kind of lay out what tool is the best one for each. But all these tools are ultimately invested in you using their tools. And for that, they're investing in you actually being able to do so.
Do you think PR is going to see a big move to automation anytime soon?
Oh, I think that we have a while to go until it's completely automated. Let's put it that way. It's interesting. I think I've seen a lot of automation tools and different things that help with simplify things. But at the same time, automation tends to take a lot of setup time at the moment. So if you think about automated media reports or competitor analysis, we always have that human layer on top of it, right? Many agencies will send a daily news scan or a weekly news scan of competitors and industry news. Things like that can be automated, but if we aren't curating it a bit as people and as humans, then we still don't end up with what we feel is quite right for the agents or for our clients that we send it out to. So where I see automation kind of playing a part is side by side with people. It's not going to replace processes completely. It's going to make us faster and better at doing processes. It's going to help us take things more out of the Googling environment and more into the curation environment for things. But it's not at the stage yet where we can remove the person completely from the process. And going back to the setup point, I mean, if you have Office 365, there's a bunch of tools that are completely underutilized within the Microsoft ecosystem. There's a tool called Microsoft Flow, which again, if you have Office 365, that's free included. And we so rarely look at that. But Flow can actually automate things like pulling in custom metrics from Twitter and any other open social media platform. So you could actually technically do all your Excel reporting for Twitter through an automated tool, but it's a bit painful to set it up. And then you also have to be pulling in that data, and you have to spend the time understanding the tool and then setting up the alerts and setting up what metrics it should be pulling through. But you do those things where you invest the time up front and it makes it easier later on. But this, of course, also then gives you an Excel row or Excel sheets with a bunch of relevant tweets. You then have to take that and make it meaningful. You have to be able to look at that information, that data, and say, okay, what is the actual highest engagement here? What does it have in common? What are we seeing the general sentiment of this tweet or this alert or this response to this campaign is coming along? And we have to use that to actually inform what we're doing and to measure and evaluate the impact of it. So automation should help save us time over time, but it doesn't replace the need for human analysis.
So don't look to automation to fill in gaps where you don't know how to do something. Instead, look to automation to make you more efficient and kind of work on things that you already understand, some stuff you know about already.
Yeah. And I think, maybe there's a place for a kind of, again, a mixed model where you automate part of it and you get kind of the bones of something in place. But I mean, no automation tool is ever going to be Shakespeare. Not that anything I've ever written is necessarily Shakespeare, but there are elements that we're missing in. And I think that there are ways to make things more efficient there. And that's going to be a huge part of it, is how do we actually free up our time and make it more efficient so that we can focus on making things great rather than base level and getting the first draft right.
You've got a service where Simply Thought plugs into other agencies in the run up to a pitch to help them win the business. Can you tell me a bit more about this? Because it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so I think the thinking behind this came from the fact that we all know the pressures of a new business. And we're always trying to think of something clever and give people that we're pitching something that they haven't seen before. And we also it's one of the few moments in the process of PR where we actually spend a lot of time in the strategy and thinking about it. And it's perhaps telling that we should be doing that far more often, or we don't always get the chance to do that when we actually get on board with the clients, because there's often a strategy already in place that they can share with us, or an initiative and their own research. So the kind of idea around this is really that we have this need to inform our creativity and to set a strategy when we're doing new business pitches. And that need felt very unfulfilled, and it's also something that needs to be done in a time crunch. So the thinking behind the new business services or pitch to win support for agencies is essentially to provide the kind of base level of research and insights and analysis on a conversation to give that base information for you to start thinking and giving your creative process and ideas and set the strategy that you think makes sense for the client. And the way we also position it is we have essentially two fees for it. One is when you just need us to send you this report and then talk you through it and let you know what the key findings are, and then to give you that jump off point for your creative and to set your strategy and give your creative. But the other thing is actually where we join you in the pitch, right? Where we are part of the pitch team and we also have services that would be sold in, whether that is if we win this piece of business, Simply Thought is going to do the measurements, or it is that if we win this piece of business, the first piece of work that we're going to do is some heavy analytics and insights work into our audience and research, and that will be handled by Simply Thought. And if that's the case, then we essentially cut our fees in half, and we're wedded to you and your success to kind of bring that across the line.
Before Simply Thought, you were part of the team that set up Archetype's insights and analytics team. I think your career and your business actually point to the fact that there is a different route to the traditional route where it came to, using media relations and writing as a career specialism. There's a new path towards database specialism happening in agencies. Do you think more agencies are going to work to create this kind of role?
I'd make the case for yes. I think that the fact that the more divert or the more kind of different routes that we can give people within this industry and this career, then the more talent that we're able to amass into this industry and the better value that we're able to bring to clients. And I think it goes back to this kind of diversity as well, not just diversity of thought or diversity of race and gender, but also that kind of different ways of thinking and just that entire approach, right? So if you are very analytically minded versus very creatively minded, if you can combine those two things, then you have something really powerful. And in any partnership, there should be people playing off each other's strengths rather than trying to overcompensate on their weaknesses. That's at least my belief in it. So if we can create more career paths that look like this within our industry, I think our industry gets better.
So I first got in touch with you after we were at the same event, the BME PR Winter Pros, and I've been following on social media for a while. You do a lot of work in diversity and inclusion, and particularly working with the blueprint. I wanted to ask you, particularly having read some of your views recently, how do you think the PR industry is doing generally when it comes to diversity?
Oh, well, to be frank, I think it's no secret, my opinions on diversity, as you say, and my overall hot take is that we are doing better and not nearly well enough, to be frank. And I think it's an interesting one, and we're in an interesting place because we have often as an industry felt that or been treated at least internally in organizations as we tell you what to say and you say it in a way that resonates, or say it in a way that works well, right? And I think particularly with many other issues, not just Black Lives Matter or racial diversity and inclusion, but also things that have happened in the past couple of years, if it's the growth of sustainability, the importance of ESG and sustainability within businesses, if it's the growth of the importance of diversity for women as well and inclusion, and if it's the entire idea of being a good employer, right? And pandemic as well has shifted a lot more responsibility and power for communicators to not just communicate externally and to put a nice spin on things or to do a nice creative campaign, but it's put both the opportunity and the responsibility for us to actually be better at pushing things internally to change so that we can credibly speak about it externally, right? We can no longer be the ones who just put a shiny glossing on the likes of big oil when they're not actually doing anything about sustainability. So I think this plays into the fact with diversity as well, that we're now seeing the shift that we need to be better at telling our clients and pushing our clients to actually do better on this before you go out and communicate on it. Because the truth of the matter is, otherwise you're going to get slammed for it, right? Someone's going to look under the hood at what you're saying and see if you're actually doing anything to follow through on that. So it becomes not just an opportunity for PR to have that seat at the table and be the voice of the external rationale to push the company to change internally first before you communicate externally, but it also becomes a responsibility to do so, to be that voice of the customer inside the business and to be a voice of the audience and external public. That's public relations, right? To be the voice of the public inside the business first. I think it's an interesting shift. So I think there's an opportunity for us there, and we're growing into that opportunity, not just with diversity and inclusion, but with many other things. You see agencies that are pushing that. But at the same time, we are not, when it comes specifically to diversity and inclusion, we too often are not good enough ourselves at actually being able to put that message to the internal practices. We aren't good enough at actually saying to an organization, all right, this is what needs to change. These are your vulnerabilities. This is how you talk about it. This is how you can authentically say, this is what we're doing. This is what we need to do better, And I think it's been an interesting one because we don't just have, that's one kind of responsibility that we have as PR and as communicators and as voices within organizations, is to make sure that you aren't just talking a good game, but you're also walking the good game, right? But then on the other side, the truth of the matter is that we also need to be better at not just communicating diversity and inclusion, we also need to be better at making work more inclusive, right? We have an industry that has touted itself on, we represent the public and we will talk, we know how to reach consumers everywhere. But we don't represent the world at all. And we've been speaking to the same group of people for the past 20 years. And, media organizations have popped up and big publications that are getting hundreds and thousands of readers that certain sectors of PR have never heard of, have never pitched. How many PRs have only pitched in the past 2-3 years, heard of Galdem, of Black Ballad, who are speaking to these communities because the likes of mainstream media, of Vogue, of the kind of well-known publications aren't speaking to this audience that that entirely different media channels have been created. And most PRs haven't been pitching these, haven't been aware of them because we're living in these eco bubbles. So if we want to be better at diversity and inclusion and creating more diverse work and work that actually does what meets the brief for clients and adds new perspectives and brings in new audiences, then we need to also be more representative of it. We need to break out of the bubbles. And it goes back to data and insights as well, is understanding your audience. That's part of what we do, and not assuming that we know it because we think this is what people do. You have that disastrous campaign by I can't remember if it's Home Office or some government organization, the anti-knife campaign, where they put anti-knife messages in chicken boxes because that's how you're supposed to reach black people. Absolute madness.
What I love about your take on this is that if you are a communications professional, it shows the power that you have and the responsibility you have. It's your job to communicate both ways, not just to go out there and say what the company wants you to say and broadcast at an audience, but actually to listen and to take what the audience is saying back into the company or the organization, and to say, look, here's what the audience actually wants. Here's what they're saying. Here's what the target market cares about right now. So you have a responsibility to communicate both ways, communicate internally as well.
Yeah. What's really interesting we're talking about these kind of audiences, I think there's two things I wanted to touch on that in terms of kind of building that business case, is sometimes it also does come down to your target audience. And you see brands that are fearful, right? And I'd always argue, do what's right because it's right. But there's also brands that are very fearful of wading into a debate that they don't feel they have an authority to. And this isn't to say that I think everyone should be posting a black square, because that doesn't mean anything. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that it's actually good business, right? To have diverse thinking and diverse people inside your organization. Harvard Business Review have been saying that for 15, 20 years. That's just a business fact. But when it comes to communicating it as well, it's a really interesting dichotomy. I think there was Mark Ritson had a really interesting analysis a couple of years ago when the Colin Kaepernick and Nike campaign started off. And his take was essentially that it's not a great purpose campaign. It's a great campaign in targeting. It's a great exercise in targeting. Because he says that Nike understands that the people who are going to buy their sneakers, who are going to buy their shoes and their sports clothes, are this younger millennial demographic who care about this topic and who care about racial equality and these things. So what Nike are actually doing by positioning themselves in that space is great targeting. And you also have this question I think it was PR Week actually did a survey after Black Lives Matter last summer, which was essentially asking people, do you think that brands should speak out on these topics? And you have this interesting thing, and this is the importance again of data and understanding data and being able to dig into it. You have this interesting dichotomy where just over half, I think it was about 56%, 59% of respondents said, no, they don't think a brand should speak out on social issues. But then you cut the data a bit more, and when you dissect it by age, you're seeing a massive over-index of anyone who's millennial and Gen Z are massively saying, yes, you should speak out on these topics. When you cut it by ethnicity, then the data by ethnicity, you see black people in over 80%, Asians close to 70%, and other minority ethnics at least over 60% saying, yes, you should absolutely be speaking out on these issues. So that may be an argument that if your audience is primarily white, older white male, then you shouldn't speak out on these issues. But in fact, it's actually also a question of you as a business. How are you going to survive? Who is going to be your next, not just customer, but who's going to be your next employee? Because there's a right way you can figure out the nuance and how should we communicate these things. But more and more, you're not going to get around having these practices, because as these generational shifts happen, this is not just your buying audience. This is also your next generation of leadership, your next generation of talent, your next generation of recruitments, right? So how is your business going to stand on these things? It doesn't even always necessarily need to be an external communication, but how do you make your business better? Because if I was in the position that I was interviewing, I'm lucky enough that I have had different options in my life, and I've thankfully had options or offers from jobs before. So that means if I was looking for a job right now, one of my questions to a potential employer is, what did you do? Right? What did you do during the pandemic? What did you do following Black Lives Matter? What is your position on racial equality? And I don't care if you have a black square. I want to know, what did you do as a business?
To find out more about